Oh, just for visuals, yeah.
Okay. Hands up if you want me to use the microphone. All right. Okay. I'll go like this, but if you can't hear or you want me to go ahead and pick it up, I'm happy to do it. So my name is Liz Carlisle, and I had the great privilege, I'm originally from Montana, and I had the great privilege to learn from a number of organic farmers in Montana, including Doug and Anna Jones Crabtree, while doing my graduate research for a degree in geography. So I'm lucky in that while studying in the university context, I really had the chance to learn directly from farmers about their experiences with organics, both farming systems, but then also sort of how do you actually make this work in your lives, as well as sort of the bottom line questions about how to build an organic business. And I now teach at Stanford University, basically in environmental studies, officially in the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. And what I want to talk about today is a question that I get asked a lot, and I suspect that some of you do too. So who's ever been asked, can organics really feed the world? Anybody been asked that question? Yeah. Oh, is anybody sick of that question? Yes. Okay, so what I'd like to do, hopefully, is give you some useful information, some up-to-date research that can help you answer that question when people do ask it of you. It's not going anywhere anytime soon because there is a whole messaging operation in the world of industrial agriculture that's interested in continuing to raise doubt about that. So I think it will behoove all of us interested in organic and agroecological agriculture to be able to answer that question well. So, and of course, this is a real challenge, global food security, right? Not only for agriculture, but really one of the biggest challenges facing humanity to make sure that we do have enough food, that everyone gets to eat what they need to meet their nutritional needs. So, I talk about this with students and I say, I want to propose what I think is a pretty modest goal, that no one in the world should go hungry. So how many of you think that is a reasonable goal for humanity? Yeah. And how many of you would consider that a moral imperative, actually, that we need to make sure? Yes, okay, absolutely. And I think this is something I often hear in the farm community. It matters to us as people who produce food. So what if we rephrase this slightly and say everybody in the world should not only be free from immediate hunger, but that they should be able to count on continuous access to sufficient, healthy, culturally appropriate food. How many people would say that's a reasonable goal for humanity? Nice one. How many of you would say that's a moral imperative? Okay, so that's our starting point here. This is this goal that we share. Now, as you probably know, we're not there yet. Any guesses? Anybody know how many people in the world eat too little to meet basic caloric needs? Now?
800 million, a billion? Maybe?
Yes, yeah. So the FAO currently estimates this at 793 million. That's a very difficult thing to actually calculate. Some people think we still are up around a billion, which is where we were the last time the FAO did this estimate. It's very difficult to get all of these figures and decide how we know whether someone's meeting basic caloric needs, but that's your more or less your figure. How about how many people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies that put their health at risk in the world? Any guesses on that number?
5 billion.
So that's a couple billion. So that's another way to think about food insecurity. Maybe you're getting enough calories on sort of a gross basis, but maybe not the right ones. And then how many people worldwide suffer from life-threatening, diet-related chronic disease?
All of them.
Oh, yeah. I like Doug's answer. That's a good one, Doug. I like that. So if we're talking about obesity, diabetes, I think there's one other one wrapped into here. Maybe cardiovascular diseases in there, 2.1 billion. So that's where we're currently at. And, of course, at the same time, so what we hear is oftentimes is that one of the reasons we have this food system we do is that we're trying to balance environmental concerns with meeting nutritional needs, but we're actually not doing very well on either count, right? So we're not meeting people's food needs, and we also have an agriculture that's associated with all of these serious environmental problems. And then, the big one that we hear about a lot, of course, is agriculture and climate change. Depending on how you account for this, 1/4 to 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide come from agriculture. So we have this huge dilemma. On one side, environmental costs of agriculture. On the other hand, even as industrial ag is saying, well, we need to be doing this intensive agriculture in order to feed the world, we're not doing that either. So this huge problem to solve. This is water scarcity issues. That's also another sort of looming sustainability problem with agriculture and food security. So we're faced with this huge challenge. And I think in order to address this challenge, it's really important to clarify our understanding of it. So I want to talk a little bit about efforts to solve it historically. I think 4 opportunities for the organic sector to be part of the solution in ways that the organic sector already is part of the solution. And then a little bit of sort of how we talk about it and different terms and sort of framings, 3 major terms and framings that are used to talk about it. So first of all, historically, right, in the middle of the 20th century, this was the answer that was put forward to how are we going to solve this looming food security crisis, the Green Revolution. Does anybody recognize this guy? Norman Borlaug, yes. So the idea that Borlaug and a number of other scientists had was we are going to breed wheat, corn, and rice varieties that will yield high. We're going to do it in these experiment stations, and then we are going to distribute those varieties to peasant farmers around the world so that they're able to grow more food because they have higher yielding crops. And they were somewhat successful in these experiment stations at increasing the yields of those 3 crops. But I think it came as quite a surprise and quite a disappointment to people involved in this that it actually did not eliminate hunger. Here we are, we've got almost 1 million people who are not meeting food security needs. So, what went wrong there? Well, we've got the same thing going on now, right? We've got Green Revolution 2.0 with GMO crops. And there's also, this is from the last week in the New York Times, this also is not providing the incredible solution to food insecurity as promised. And it's actually led to some troubling consequences, both the original Green Revolution and this 2.0, that have increased food insecurity, made the problem worse, actually undermined the basis of food security. And the most quickly recognized among those consequences have been the environmental problems on that list. So, of course, the solution that has been proposed, I would say in a major way in the 80s in terms of the scientific community, and that most of us in the organic community are trying to work with, is the idea that we could have sufficient yields and also not cause environmental problems if we practiced agroecological farming. So this is the first of the 4 opportunities, I think, for the organic sector to contribute to global food security, is that this is what we've been focusing on developing, is treating our farming systems as ecosystems so that we could grow food without undermining all the resources that we need for agriculture and without contributing to these global scale issues. And the good news is that this is actually a benefit for yields as well. So not only are we not causing negative externalities, we also have the potential, especially as you think about the longer time scales, to do better on yields. And there's actually a new paper that just came out about this. I encourage all of you to take a look. It's in the journal Sustainability. The lead author is Lauren Panicio. It's co-authored with Paul Ehrlich, who you might remember from the population bomb. And this is a really big deal. It's a big shift in his thinking, and he's quite influential. Lauren is an incredible researcher who's looked a lot at this question of can organics feed the world. But this is a little bit dense, but I want to take you through a couple things. So Lauren has done this big meta-analysis and found that the quote yield gap between organic and conventional on a global basis was smaller than thought. And it's an average of 15 to 22%, depending on the crop. But that, that's crop by crop. In oats, actually, there's basically no discrepancy. But I think what's important about this is that then they started looking at what if you use diversification practices? So what if and agroecological practices? So if you multi-crop, or if you plant a sequence of crops, if you rotate, that brings this quote yield gap down just with those two practices to 9% if you are intercropping and 8% if you're doing crop rotation. And again, this is looking at studies who met a series of criteria that are doing side-by-sides of conventional and organic production. And they looked at other kinds of diversification practices too. And what they ended up concluding is that different combinations of crops, climate, and diversification practices outperformed industrial agriculture. So if you're doing the right kind of agriculture for your place, and you're utilizing agroecological practices, you can out-yield industrial yields. So the problem, even with this statistic, which people in the organic community were generally pretty happy with, that this yield gap was smaller than thought, is that that's not an apples to oranges comparison exactly, and it's not necessarily agroecological organic. It tended to be organic systems that didn't have optimal nitrogen. Whereas organic systems that were doing enough cover cropping, crop rotation, these kinds of things, actually could outperform industrial agriculture. So that's the first big opportunity, I think, for organics and global food security, is that if we're utilizing those agroecological practices that our movement is associated with, especially in the long run, as industrial agriculture starts to see, when the chickens come home to roost with some of these environmental degrading practices, we're going to come out ahead on yields. The problem, however, with stopping there is this. So this is another quote from the same study. Yield, however, is largely irrelevant to determining whether people are fed or the amount of land in production, which is really important when you think about the association between agriculture and climate change. So, there's a curveball, right? How do we know this? Well, Panicio and Ehrlich go through a number of reasons in their analysis, but here's a really big one. Here's a really big piece of evidence for that, is that we do currently in agriculture globally produce enough food that everyone could theoretically have enough to eat. The problem is it's not getting where it needs to be. So that's where these next three opportunities for organic agriculture come in. Because the problem, the global food security problem, is not really a problem of production. There's some concern that it may become one in the future as population grows and perhaps as we solve some of these other problems, but that's not the problem right now. So what is the problem? Well, here's one of the problems. You might know this book from the early 1970s, Frances Moore Lappé, Diet for a Small Planet, influenced a lot of people who started in on plant-based diets, sold 3 million copies. And she made a pretty basic point about the number of people whose caloric needs can be met on a certain amount of land, depending on what you produced on that land. And what she was saying basically is that it's really inefficient for us to run all of our calories through a cow. And in the United States, we're eating a lot of meat, and what we need to be doing is shifting towards more plants in our diet so that there are enough of these plant-based calories for everybody in the world. And she talked about traditional diets where grains and legumes are combined. And a lot of people did move to vegetarian diets after reading that book. Now, of course, the discussion has evolved to include climate change as a reason to move towards plant-based diets because our meat systems are so associated with greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a graph from the Environmental Working Group with the carbon footprint of various common foods. These are all animal proteins. These are legumes down here, and some vegetables and some grains kind of in the middle. But, you know, there's also another piece of the story, which is that both that Environmental Working Group study and Francis Moore Lepay's book are talking about concentrated animal feeding operations, which are totally unsustainable in every sense of the word. Huge part of the climate change problem, huge part of the food insecurity problem, tremendously inefficient to be, you know, growing grain over here with a bunch of chemicals. That's where a lot of the climate change issue is that you're using all this synthetic nitrogen fertilizer on this grain to feed these cattle over here. That synthetic nitrogen fertilizer takes a lot of natural gas to manufacture, and you need an awful lot of that grain in order to feed these cattle over here. There's the emissions associated with getting it there, right? And then how much transportation happens before that meat gets to a consumer in a fast food restaurant. You know, it's obviously not sustainable for the animals, it's not sustainable for the land, there's an issue with manure, on and on and on. So one thing organics can be part of, certainly, is encouraging healthy production of plant-based foods. A number of people here do that, and grow grains and legumes, which can be combined to produce adequate nutrition for people. But the other thing that we're involved in the organic community is more pasture-based management of meats, which doesn't have all of the negative consequences associated with it that the concentrated animal feeding operations do. And in some cases, and this is on the border of Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico, there are landscapes that are not appropriate to farm, that are appropriate to ranch. So another thing that I think the organic community can contribute to is this innovation in pastured meat, pastured poultry, grass-fed, grass-finished beef. I think this is a part of the solution as well. So that's one opportunity. Opportunity number 2. Opportunity number 3. So does anybody know south of the border what % of the food in the U.S. is wasted?
30-20%.
Yeah, between 30 and half. So about 40% of all the food produced in the United States is wasted. So this is obviously, when people ask you, can organics feed the world? It's like, what's the problem? A huge part of the problem is food waste. And that food waste is happening actually throughout the supply chain. So it's happening because in the conventional commodity system, prices are determined on global markets that are influenced by all these crazy factors. And a farmer can have a crop in a field that was, grown well, not affected by the weather. But because of what happens in the global market, it's not economic for that farmer to harvest that crop. So that food waste can happen in the field for no fault of the farmer or anybody else in the supply chain, but just because global commodity prices did something and they can no longer afford to get their combine out there and harvest it because the price they're going to get for it is so minimal. So that happens. You also have, and this is more in the developing world, you have in the distribution chain, you have poor refrigeration or storage, and food gets wasted that way. A huge way in the United States that it gets wasted, and I'm sure this is true in Canada too, the statistic in the US is that grocery stores reject about 20% of produce that is healthy and fresh and safe for people to eat, just because it doesn't look quite right. It's a little bit funny shape, or it's a little bit small. And I mean just a little bit small, because they found that consumers have sort of been trained through marketing that they're going to take the bigger apple. Just a slightly smaller apple isn't going to go anywhere. So until very recently, all of this was just thrown away. We now have laws in some states that say you have to compost it. We have some organizations working to try to recover that. So that's another place in the supply chain where food gets wasted, and then of course also just in people's homes. So this is a great graphic produced by Food Shift that breaks some of this down. But I think this is a great opportunity for the organic community.
I just got a question about wasting food there. So if they were to increase our price on the farm for food and increase it in the store, would there be less waste?
I think where the organic community has an opportunity here actually is in our innovation around models that connect consumers to producers in different ways, where the value of that food sort of stays with it throughout, and it's not so much, it's not these systems that have these other incentives in them. So I was thinking here of, you know, things like CSAs, for example, which I think is a great innovation for wasting less food, having less of that opportunity in the middle for that food to get wasted. But I think also just a higher value product. There's different incentives in the system when people are getting paid something nearer to the real cost of the food. If the food has such a low value financially that the grocery store can just reject 20% of it, or the farmer is forced to leave it in the field, then it's going to get wasted. But if we, I think as an organic community, are driving this conversation about, you know, we actually need to value our food more than we do. It's crazy that Americans pay less than 10% of their annual you know, household expenditures on food. If we say, you know, this is something valuable, we need to value it, it will no longer make economic sense for grocery stores to reject this food, for them to let it you know, go old and then not do anything with it. And it certainly you know, wouldn't make sense for a farmer to leave it in the field and not harvest it. So I think this is, yeah.
Just another question to that. So I heard the percentage that Europeans pay for food is a lot higher than
Yes.
we pay. Like
In the 20s.
In the 20s.
Yeah, and it was that way in the United States, you know, a generation or two ago as well. So when people say, this is another sort of how do you answer these questions you get all the time, right? Organics is too expensive. You know, in a lot of cases, there's actually not a huge difference, but when there is, you know, the problem isn't the cost of organics. The problem is the cost of everything else. You know, and how did we get to that place where we're not paying enough for our food to actually get healthy food and to actually sustain a community of food producers and to actually have, you know, healthy countries. You know, in Canada, maybe you feel the pain of this somewhat more because you do have a public health system. We're certainly starting to wake up to the fact in the United States that the money we're not spending on our food, we're turning around and spending on our healthcare premiums. And there was some great, I think it was Michael Pollan who put out this great statistic that showed that we basically just swapped those two household expenditures. But the healthcare costs are going up so much right now that those are going to end up being higher you know, than what we paid for food at a time when we didn't have you know, the systems that we do. And then a fourth opportunity, I think, you know, here's another way in which the speed the world question is actually a little bit the wrong question. So as many of you probably know, due to legislation in the United States, we've diverted a lot of land that was used for growing food to growing fuel because we have an incentive for people to grow corn for ethanol. And studies have been done on a life cycle analysis basis and found that this isn't really sustainable in any sense. It's not helping the climate change problem, it's not helping the energy problem, and it's certainly not helping global food security issues. So it was, I think, in 2008 that this really affected corn prices throughout the world, and many people who rely on corn as a staple food weren't able to afford it because we flooded the market with this cheap corn because of this mandate. So I think here's another thing we have the opportunity in the organic community to address beyond just sort of this yields question, but looking at some of the real causes of food insecurity right now is to say, you know, either we're growing food crops rather than ethanol, or we are thinking about second generation biofuels that don't compete with land for food. Either they're grown on land that's not being used for food, or they get a double use, like this oil barn project that Bob Quinn has going in Montana on kind of a pilot basis right now, where you grow high oleic safflower, you use it first as a cooking oil, and then recycle that and use it as a fuel. Those kinds of ideas, I think, make a lot more sense than corn ethanol. So this is this graphic about, you know, this choice basically about how we're going to use our productive lands. And there was a lot of, in 2008, a lot of news coverage of this issue of, you know, basically, do Americans get to drive their SUVs and people in Mexico don't get to eat their tortillas, and is that just? So in one way or the other, most of these problems are not problems that are about lack of resources, but distribution of resources and choices that we're making in our food system. And I think in addition to innovating in agroecology and sustainable production, I think organics has a real opportunity to look at systems that help with these problems too, of food waste, getting rid of the unsustainable confinement meat system, and also of, eliminating biofuels that are part of the problem and innovating others for food crops instead. So, 3 different ways then to actually talk about this with a term. So the title of my talk was Global Food Security, and that's the phrase that the UN uses. It's what you tend to hear most commonly in the global dialogue about. It's sort of the evolution beyond what we used to talk about as hunger. Now understood, that definition I gave you earlier that includes food availability, access to food of sufficient quantity and quality, a stable supply, and culturally acceptable food. So this is not a bad starting point to talk about something that we all care about, that we can contribute to as the organic community. But I think we can do better, and here's a couple of other options that have been put forward. One of them is food justice. And the definition here is ensuring that the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown, produced, transported, and distributed, and accessed and eaten are shared fairly. So this is trying to get at the fact that we have this not sort of a gross lack of resources or food, but we have this unevenness in our food system in all parts of the supply chain. And this is just one graph of how this plays out in terms of undernourishment around the world. Those 780 million people who are food insecure are concentrated in particular places for reasons that have to do with politics. And that's often what we find in the rest of the supply chain too, whether you're talking about uneven access to the benefits of our food system or uneven exposure to its risks. And rural communities all over the place are bearing more of the risk associated with the industrial food system. What do those chemicals do to our water supply? What do those business models do to our communities, right? They often empty them out. So this is one way of talking about it. And then another one that I really like is this notion of food sovereignty. And this has a shorter definition, which is the right of nations and peoples to control their own food systems. And so the theory at the heart of this term is that the way to have a more food secure and sustainable world is actually to have a more democratic world. And that if we're able to make our own choices about our own food systems, rather than having multinational corporations dictating what's happening in a lot of this sector, a lot of this industry, then we're actually better able to feed our communities, as well as create good jobs in our communities, all of the other sort of positive things that can come out of agriculture. And I actually have the same chart in here that Dave had in his talk, because I think this illustrates why food sovereignty is so important. And I also was going to point out, that we have now some of these big red dots are actually combining with each other. DuPont and Dow, Monsanto and Bayer. And you all know how hard it is to do sane agriculture in a world where our seed systems are this concentrated. And so what food sovereignty says is that no, what we need is we actually need in all of our different places to have control over our seed resource, as we have for most of human history. And we can decide what seeds we need for our production systems. I think the Organic Seed Alliance is doing great work in trying to breed seeds that are appropriate for organic systems. That's hard work to do when you have an industry structure like this. So lots and lots of different food sovereignty efforts around the world. Since I'm living in the San Francisco Bay Area right now, one that I've been aware of, even in an urban community, is that to sort of contest that seed system, a group of people have started at the public library a seed library where people can freely exchange the seeds that they've grown out in their gardens And people are saving seed that is adapted to their place. And actually our place is kind of funky. It's quite foggy, and people actually get a lot of their moisture through fog. And that has consequences actually for over time. If you save your seeds, you develop kind of a little bit of a adapted variety for that place. And they're sharing them through the seed library. And it actually required legislation to make this okay. For those of you familiar with the Sustainable Economies Law Center, they have been working state by state in the United States to protect these seed libraries at public libraries. This has been a big movement in the United States, from being subject to the laws that govern these people. So in many states, these have actually been regulated under the laws that these large corporations have to sell seed, because it's kind of a long story, but basically they had to create the same kinds of labels subject to the same kind of standards for backyard organic gardeners who just want to exchange seeds with their neighbors with information that they didn't even have. Luckily, this organization has been successful in getting these bills passed in a number of states. But even at this level, sometimes it can be very difficult for us to retake control of our food systems from seed to table. So, kind of to wrap up, can organic feed the world? If you've only got time for a yes or no answer and you're in an elevator, yes. Right? And the first thing somebody probably wants to know is about yields. And the answer there is, well, they're pretty close to each other. If you use agroecological practices and you're doing organic right, they're pretty much equivalent. If we invested the amount of money in organic research that we have in the research for the industrial side, we're probably going to do better. And if you fast forward 50 to 100 years, we probably don't have a choice. These industrial systems are so terrible for the environment, and they're definitely undermining the basis of their own productivity. You can't treat the soil like that and continue to yield well. So the answer is yes. And then the other answer is, we're currently producing enough food for everybody, but 780 million people don't have enough food to eat, and 2 billion people don't have the right food to eat. So we also need to answer that question. And organics, as a community and a movement, is, I think, really well poised to try to address some of those problems of distribution and food waste and really equity. So I will leave it there. I definitely want you to check out this paper in Sustainability by Panicio and Ehrlich for all the citations and all of the incredible analysis of studies that have looked at these questions. And I'm happy to take any questions now that you have. And
just want to share what I say when I get that question.
yes.
Yes, of course, organic can feed the world, but I turn the question around and say, can conventional agriculture feed the world after fossil fuels run out? And I think that's the real question. Is conventional agriculture isn't preparing the soil to be resilient enough to feed the world once the crutch of chemical fertilizer is taken away. And we know that's a finite resource, so sooner or later it's going to be gone. And organics preparing the soil to be more resilient, more fertile, without those crutches. So that's mine.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, it's that system is completely chemically addicted to more than one chemical, but definitely to those fossil fuel-based fertilizers. Yeah, Doug.
I think one other answer to that question is that if you actually look at the data, and I don't have it here to present, but the smaller the farm, the more efficient it is in producing calories per input, either labor or energy. And whether we're talking about smallholder farms in Africa or small urban farms in the United States, that's where food is really produced efficiently. It's not on humongous, even organic farms, but certainly not on humongous non-organic monoculture operations. And, the whole idea is just a fallacy. The idea of efficiency in chemical agriculture is not so.
Yeah, and I think a struggle for Lauren in doing her meta-analysis, people have finally started in their research when they do these side-by-sides to look at total calories, or at least to look at more than one crop. But for a long time, they were only evaluations of, the dominant cash crop. So you have somebody over here who was just growing corn, and you have somebody over here who's growing corn and beans and squash and verdolagas. And then, the analysis would say, well, this person's growing this much corn and this person is growing that much corn. But what about the beans and the squash and the verdolagas, right? And not only were they eating the beans, but there was some nitrogen going into the ground from those beans. And not only were they eating the squash, but there was some ground cover there, so they weren't getting the same amount of erosion. So that yield equivalency ratio, which is sort of calories per acre, has started to be used a little bit more. And that's where they found that when people had multiple crops, whether they were in time or in space, crop rotation or intercropping, that yeah, absolutely, much better. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, something that doesn't get mentioned enough is the benefit that organic systems have on water percolation and feeding the aquifer, and the fact that we're gonna run out of water, and if you did it on a large scale, like I think New York State actually did improve their aquifer by doing certain things. And
yeah, they found, the state of New York did a study and found that it would be cheaper for them, instead of cleaning all the poison out of their water, to actually just buy up the land and have people steward it. That was their watershed. So, absolutely, I think that water is a resource that we have to, fossil fuels have been on the map for a little while, but water shortage, certainly in California, is really coming to a head. Both water quantity and water quality, as Dave was showing the slides of Des Moines suing those counties upstream in Iowa. Yeah, I mean, that in our terms at Stanford, that's organic providing an ecosystem service through water quality and quantity. Yeah.
When I address this question of can we feed the world, first thing I say is we made it our responsibility to feed the world.
Yes.
And when you look at agricultural policy in Canada, there's no mention of feeding the world in our ag policy. It falls under international development, but it's not part of ag policy. Ag policy is for the betterment of Canadians and economic growth and so on. And so it's very much a business model. And the reality is, as you pointed out, is that it's not like we're giving the food away and we're actually feeding the world. We're selling food to the world. And we're giving them an opportunity to buy our food by growing it. But the reality is that 70% of the world's food supply is being produced by small-scale agriculture in developing countries. And so if we're under the illusion that we are the ones feeding the world, we're not in the right mindset, right? And this is where I think organic has the biggest value, is that if we can apply the agroecological practices that you're talking about in small-scale agriculture in developing countries, that's where we'll have the biggest impact in terms of food security.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when we do give it away, that's not always a great thing, because what happens to those farmers, right? If somebody leaves land that they have been stewarding for multiple generations, because for 2 years we were dumping food aid, and people could get free corn instead of paying an affordable price for it, then you've lost. That land is out of farming. Yeah.
So one comment or question, as much as when we talk about sort of reducing food waste, it comes at a time when, thinking back to some of the organic food that was coming on the market 2 decades ago, it was pretty shoddy, sad, nasty things. Some wilted bunch of carrots with bacterial blotch, but they were grown organically. In those two decades since, we've made tremendous improvements in the quality, the appearance, the overall freshness of organic produce. So it's that one point, if we reduce waste, how much do we also go back to providing some sad, inferior product that doesn't allow organics to grow?
Well, we also have, I think, good systems for utilizing, the stuff that, people around me, maybe what they do is they have some of their stuff that goes to Whole Foods, and then they have a CSA, and then they have, maybe they go to one farmer's market, and then of course they have a composting operation. So something that's perfect is going to go in their distribution deal to the supermarket, where probably people are there for healthy food that they can serve at a dinner party, they're not necessarily on board with the whole organic movement. Then they have CSA customers who are the partners in the farm and who are happy with something that doesn't look quite right and they're going to put it in soup. And then they have, you know, at the end of the day, if they have something that's really not good enough quality for somebody to eat, they have a way to cycle those nutrients rather than it just going in the landfill, which is what happens with most of that 20% stuff. I mean, it just goes in the dumpster in the back of the grocery store. And causes really bad methane emissions. Actually, if you look at the methane emissions out of landfills and the degree to which that's contributing to climate change and how much of those are things that could be diverted, either because they're cyclable in some way or just could have been consumed when they were good.
Yeah, just further to the gentleman in the front's point, like, I'm curious how if you know how the percentages shake out in other parts of the world, but like in Canada, I think the percentage of farmers is like something like between 1% and 10% of the population, like a very small piece of the population.
Yeah.
Trying to grow the food for the whole rest of the population.
Yeah.
I don't know if those numbers are like super uneven in other parts of the world, but it seems to me like it's a really fragile system to have like this really small number of people trying to feed this huge skyrocketing population base that, I don't know, is that the case?
I think
You
so.
know, if it's the case?
Yeah, so I'm behind Doug and Hannah's apprenticeship program. Grow more farmers, have them on, you know, a couple thousand acres rather
Well,
than.
or have like more city dwellers take some responsibility, like.
Yeah, yeah, and we love it, we love it. You know, to us, this is like romantic, right, you know?
Well, and let's maybe I'll just add, like in the States, I think it's less than 1% of our population is in production agriculture. And that's even swayed weird because USDA defines a farm as anything, what, less than $1,000 of income. So there's way not many of us doing that. And then in the state of Montana alone, there's 18 million acres of cropland, and less than 1/2 of that is only certified organic. So we have a very minor amount of farmers, a very minor amount of cropland. And this question of ecosystem services, I think we need more organic farmers. We need more farmers, period, but more organic farmers doing something at scale that's really going to help us handle the greenhouse gas emissions, water, ecosystem service issue.
Well, it could even be like framed differently in that we don't need like everybody to be a farmer, but like just maybe take responsibility to growing at least a small portion of your food instead of like going to soccer, you know, like, grow like 2 hills of potatoes. You know?
And we have so many historical examples of people doing that. So like, you know, victory gardens during World War II times in the US, people grew an astonishing amount of their produce. And I think the grains, which is kind of what I've been engaged with. I'm from Montana and I've learned from these folks who grow grains and legumes. I think this model of, you know, we need to get more young farmers who are prepared to be our grain and legume stewards. That makes sense. I think that's production agriculture that needs to do that. And then in terms of that micronutrient density that's going to come from your produce, I think absolutely a lot more of that we could all be doing ourselves. And those are, I mean, that's a whole other story about the unsustainability of the produce system, which I see up close and personal in California. And it's, you know, labor, immigration, really nasty chemical use, all tied up in that. You really should not be growing lettuce, even organically, you know, on hundreds of acres in a monocrop.
Sort of just to add what she's saying too is I think that if people in the city grew even few things, I think they would have more respect for what they bought in the store, and I think they would also feel less likely to throw it away.
Yes.
Because I've taught kids like organic field days and stuff, and we planted a seed, and I've sent them home with a tomato seed in the thing, and I've talked to them about it. I said, think about it all summer long, all the things you have to do in order to keep that tomato alive. Because it's a big deal to keep it alive. If you leave it, it dies.
Yep.
And if a farmer just walked away, there would be no food. So I think it also fulfills that circle of realizing what it takes to get the groceries to the store.
Yeah, I think you're right. And have you seen, there's been some research too that shows that kids are more likely to eat vegetables, you know, find them palatable if they were actually involved in growing them. There's this, like some kind of a connection. Maybe it's trust. Or maybe it's pride.
It tastes better.
Yeah, that too, yeah.
with the state's election going on now, is there any talk about, like there is here, about carbon tax?
You know, like 2 years ago, there was some great work on trying to insert a lot of forward-thinking issues into the presidential election. And there's a great, the Union of Concerned Scientists has a great initiative called the Plate of the Union to try to get this on the radar of the next presidential candidate. And they did great work throughout the primaries. Unfortunately, we're just not having a very high level of political discussion. We're kind of playing defense. We don't have a lot of like forward thinking going on right now. It's just, can we prevent the apocalypse? So you'll be happy to know I'm not staying in Saskatchewan very long. I will get on a plane tomorrow and I will be in my polling place on Tuesday.
Coming back to Canada?
Save my spot.
But if you're on the undecided end of it, what are you gonna do? Nobody's going to the polling station.
Right, yeah. You'll get bombarded by reporters your entire way there. No, that's true. What we do have, though, is a lot of good work, I think, being done at other levels of government. So I think that's always important to keep in mind, too. And you get frustrated with, for example, in the United States, the Farm Bill, our biggest legislative target, this huge conglomerate of federal legislation that comes up about every 5 or 6 years. When we have gridlock in Congress, it can get frustrating to think about what can we do about that. But at the same time, there are these things we can do, like allow city dwellers to have backyard chickens. A bunch of people have been working on those kind of laws in municipal scale. And then they can use their, the food they grew in their garden that's excess or doesn't look pretty, they can feed that to their chickens. And, multiple other good things can come out of some of those. Or cottage food laws, which allow people who, usually it's if they're making less than $5,000 a year. So if they're selling jam at the farmer's market, they don't have to go and get a commercial kitchen to do that. They can do that in their own house. Yeah.
I have a few puzzles. I'm a long-term organic farmer. It's field crop agriculture mostly. I have cattle as well. And I don't dispute for a moment that organics can feed the world. I think most of the world is fed organically at the moment anyway.
Right.
But what I do, what I've done all of my working life, is very dependent on fossil fuel. It's not nitrogen fertilizer, it's not herbicides, but I burn a hell of a lot of diesel. And this troubles me. I don't see a way out of it. If I did, I would embark. But I don't see how I earn a livelihood, how I grow enough grain and legumes and beef without. And I'm just wondering how we puzzle through.
Yeah. Good.
We probably burn more fuel than you do. One of our efforts in that direction was to try to grow oilseed crops and then use biodiesel. Now, we didn't get so crazy as to make it ourselves, but our neighbor, Bob Quinn, that Liz mentioned earlier, has a unique model where they actually create a business where they crush safflower oil, sell it as culinary oil to make food out of, then they recollect it. He actually says he leases the oil and then takes it back. And he uses the oil to fuel one of his tractors. So, all of this, nobody's going to find one silver bullet that is the answer. But if we all think about how do we move in the right direction, I think that's part of the answer.
Well, I think too, what's interesting to Doug and I is a lot of people say, well, just farm with horses. We'll say, well, okay, you quit driving your Prius, and you quit having the solar panels on your building, because that's technology also.
Right.
So I think part of it is how do we be really smart about the fossil fuel that we are using, And we as a society are gonna have to make some choices about where that goes. And we're also gonna have to start investing in other technology. Why can't we have technology as farmers too? I don't need GPS technology, I need a combine that runs off solar energy.
Exactly.
Right? So how do we start that conversation also?
Well, and I think part of the answer too is not to not be thinking about how we move forward, but simply by leaving behind nitrogen fertilizer, that is
Yeah. No, our
40 to 60% of the
Our farm
energy
has been
use.
energy audited, and we're in the top 10% of
Yeah.
farms in terms of
So
energy.
how do we take the next step?
But I'm still ashamed of what I do.
I think too, in terms of your horse-drawn equipment or whatever, I mean, horses need food too, so that's still an energy draw.
Well, back to the question here, I mean, if less than 1% of us are actually farming, there's not enough people farming. So, I mean, you're gonna need a lot more people that want to farm. And I just will be blunt, I mean, our apprentice program, it looks really great, but it's a lot of hard work. And we are really questioning where that next generation is gonna come from. Because I think we're gonna have different models of how we provide them farming professional opportunities. Because we don't have people that are ready to totally take on a risk and the manage rights. So,
It's expensive.
not to be a downer, but I think, I mean, it's pretty sexy to grow a CSA vegetable production and sell at Bozeman's Farmers Market, but how sustainable is that business? Are those folks still around 10 years later? I'm not sure. And yet, you know, how do we get people back on the prairies and rural communities, like with a business that's actually sustaining themselves too?
Well, you know, just to add to that, I was supposed to introduce you, and I'm very sorry, I was late, I was talking to a farmer. I certify organic farmers, but he's a young guy who farms 6,000 acres conventionally. He's converted 80 acres to organic, and he would like to move more. His problem is, over his whole farm, he has to make $170 per acre in order to pay for everything. So we went through all of these scenarios. How could you do it, switch it all over? He has to make $170 per acre, so how can he actually do that? Like, it's very hard, unless he's willing to sell a bunch of land. I mean, you have to have so much money. It's very hard, like in some cases, right, because we want more farmers, but then even farmers who are existing, it's still really expensive. And you have to find a solution for each farmer to be able to do that. And if you have no land base, if you're a new guy, how do you buy land at $170 an acre? If you have to buy it at that price too, it's very, very expensive industry to get into.
Yeah, so I think some of this we can't internalize as an organic farming community. We're very good at helping one another and being innovative ourselves and making sacrifices ourselves. But it's time for all the people who benefit from what we do, which is everybody, right? To think about stewardship and investing in stewardship and this as a model of ecological agriculture. Another thing that's in this paper that I keep pushing, this Penicio and Ehrlich, is this debate about how are we going to save the world? Are we going to put a few areas in really intensive industrial agriculture so we can save the rest for nature preserves? That's called land sparing, and it was like the dominant thinking for a long time. But the thinking is moving towards land sharing, which is, no, we're not going to sacrifice this land for agriculture. We're going to have an agriculture that's part of the solution, which is land sharing. So we're going to get our ecosystem services and our biodiversity, all of these things, on the same land where we're also producing food. And if that's our paradigm for dealing with climate change and lots of other environmental issues, and this is the way we're trying to solve a public problem, in addition to, obviously, the food security problem, then there needs to be some more public investment, I think. And there needs to be some more policy. We've had decades of policy that subsidize the industrial food system. We need to start thinking about shifting some of those resources so that we're actually paying people to. I think there's some pretty good, interesting models of what if we paid people for the ecosystem services that they're producing as organic farmers. I don't know what the right metric is there, if it's about carbon, if it's about practices like cover cropping, but it shouldn't just be on the organic sector itself, I don't think.
And this is like, I mentioned briefly, I'm Andy Hammerweiss with the Organic Ag Center of Canada, and there's a few of us that are involved in the national scope of the organic sector that are being consulted by Ag Canada right now on the next policy framework. And so, like, and Ag Canada is actually really looking to us, like, more than we have ever been looked at before, as a new government, and much more interested in environmental issues, and looking at organic systems and possible solutions to some of the agricultural issues. So one of the things they're asking us, and we're going to be, Tia has been invited to go to the House Standing Committee on Agriculture with CODA, Canadian Organic Trade Association, and Canadian Organic Growers was just there, and we're being invited to present there and give advice on what kind of policies should we have in agriculture right now. And they're looking for specific recommendations. And so I'm thinking about things like, well, give an incentive to have perennial forages in your cropping system. As just a very basic thing, because when they create agricultural policy, the policy is about all of agriculture. They don't want to develop policy strictly for organic. They want to have policy that can influence more widely. So you make a recommendation, well, if there's an incentive to put perennial forages into your landscape, then you have a healthier soil, your soil building, put legumes in, you'll fix nitrogen, you can fix carbon deeper in the soil profile, reduce nitrogen fertilizer requirements and the energy costs associated with it. So there can be like one little thing like that can have a big impact, and also give us something that we can access as a supporting tool. So, yeah.
And if you have a perennial forage in your rotation as a conventional farmer, you can get into organics faster and easier.
Yeah.
The slippery slope.
And all these other, multifunctional benefits, the biodiversity aspect, and pollinators, and reduced nitrate leaching in the environment, and, there's so many different, and also thinking about transition programs, should we have a transition program? And how do you pitch organic transition support? Well, let's have transition support for all of agriculture, for anybody who's shifting in their production system, make it palatable for the government, and then create a program that makes it more accessible for us. And so I'm looking for ideas, and we're going to be there again in a couple of weeks. And so if you catch me, if you have an idea, like send an email or catch me today, and much appreciate your feedback and thoughts.
Well, it's 11 o'clock, and I want to make sure we make it back to the convention hall for DAG. But I also want to thank everyone for this really terrific discussion. I learned an awful lot from you today, so I'm so glad that we had half an hour left over for that. And yeah, I look forward to hopefully to meeting some of you individually and talking about what you do.